Now you guys know as well as I do that we really did not need another Tubescreamer. But when someone as passionate as David Brown from Brown Amplification is about that circuit, then I'm sort of tempted to give him a chance. Now I've never shied away from Tubescreamers. In fact, I quite like them a lot. I remember in my early days of my guitar playing career, before I even really knew what pedals were and I was just starting to experiment with the dirtier tones in my little beginner amp, my dad comes up to my room and says, we need to get you a Tubescreamer because that is the be-all and end-all of overdrive pedals. And in some ways he was right. Since then, the Tubescreamer in one way or another has been a reasonably big part of my sound and my rig. Over the years I've probably played 30 iterations of a Tubescreamer, clones of a Tubescreamer, and I've got 3 all-time favourites. Number 1, the JHS Bonsai, which I don't have anymore, but it is every Tubescreamer in one pedal. The Origin Effects Halcyon Green, which is, in my opinion, the most finely tuned, polished Tubescreamer there is. And then number 3, this one that I've got on the board down here, the Gritador from Brown Amplification. For me, the Gritador is probably the most unique screamer I've played, and probably the furthest removed from a classic traditional Tubescreamer, at least out of those other 2 that I just mentioned. Let's get some tones, let's hear it. I'm going to play the old trusty Telecaster into the Victory V40 to start with for some cleaner tones, and then we'll change things up later on. So, my clean tone. And then the Gritador. So as far as I know, the Tubescreamer is Dave Brown's absolute favourite ever circuit. So much so that I think he originally wanted the green side of the protein to be this Gritador, basically, which is actually kind of crazy to think about. You know, I bet there's an alternate universe out there where the green side of the protein is actually a Tubescreamer. Crazy. That would have been cool, maybe a special edition one day. However, even though the Tubescreamer is Dave's favourite ever pedal, we've all got to admit that the Tubescreamer is a bit Marmite. People either love it or people either hate it. So Dave set out to make a screamer for the people. And I think there are 5 key changes from a traditional screamer that make the Gritador quite special. Number 1, the gain and the clipping feels very different to a traditional Tubescreamer. Number 2, the mid hump is very much less pronounced. Number 3, there is definitely more low end, but that low end is tighter somehow. 4, some of that harsh high end that you get with some Tubescreamers is smoothened off, so it's less clangy. And number 5, I would also say that the clean blend is quite a bit less obvious. Let's start with number 1, the gain. I don't know if this pedal has more gain than a TS9, shall we say, but it definitely has more usable gain. Once you start to crank up the gain on one of those old Tubescreamers, it does start to fall in on itself a little bit, and you start to lose definition between the strings. With the Gritador, that seems to happen much higher up on the gain range, so you can still get that sound if you want that kind of falling in on itself sound. But before that, you have a much more linear sweep of gain, I would say. I also think that they've tamed that mid hump that we associate with a screamer, moved it about a little bit, cleaned it up a little bit, and it's a much more usable mid-range now. In conjunction with smoothing off some of those highs that I mentioned, I think the overall focus of this pedal is ever so slightly lower down in the mid-range compared to a classic Tubescreamer. In a way, this is more of a mid-forward drive now rather than a mid-pushed drive, if you know what I mean. It's still very distinct in the mid-range for sure, but I think it's just going to make it much more usable in loads of different types of amps. Speaking of which, let's change amplifiers, because I feel like I'm in sort of a bluesy John Mayer world at the moment. Let's change amps, and maybe I'll change guitar as well. So we switched over to the Victory Sheriff, and as you can hear, it's got a bit more gain to start with. And also playing this Les Paul Jr. And with the Gritador, it just has a completely different character, and it does that thing that people associate with Tubescreamers in this sense, is that it just tightens up a rock and roll amp, pushes the mids even more, and it's a great sound. For me, this is my favourite use of the Gritador, going into a more characterful amp, which is not the same with a lot of Tubescreamers. Sometimes I like a Tubescreamer into a clean amp, but not so much a gainier amp like this. For me, this works great into this amp. Adding a bit more juice, adding a bit more punch in the mid-range, but also tightening and thickening that low end. It's really, really cool. Somehow they've given a Tubescreamer type circuit more low end, but kept it more under control. One of the most divisive things I think about a Tubescreamer is that clean blend, or at least I sort of have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. I find that sometimes my ear can tune into that clean blend, and then I can't unhear it, and it can get really weird and annoying in my head. Whereas with this, yes, it was a bit more obvious into the clean amplifier, but into that gainier amp, it just blends in so nicely. And I think overall, with that tighter bottom end and that slightly nicer clean blend, it just overall adds to the string definition and what I mentioned earlier about it doesn't cave in on itself until much later on in the gain sweep. the fact still remains, we didn't really need another Tubescreamer, let's be honest. But us as guitar players, we're never really concerned with need, are we? It's all about want with us. We want more. And I think the Gritador is a welcome addition to the Screamer world. It has its own thing going on. It is tweaked a little bit differently to others that I've tried. And at the end of the day, I enjoy seeing what a builder can do, putting his own spin or putting their own spin on things. That can only be a good thing for us players. It gives us more ingredients to cook with or more colours to paint with.